Entering the Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Let's talk about one of the most undercovered parts of the fantasy football preseason. That is auction draft strategy and how it's changed from even 5 years ago to what we're seeing right now in 2021. You always hear people talk about how much better auction is than snake drafting. I think that everyone almost by consensus agrees with that statement. The problem is when you see experts leagues or people are drafting high stakes leagues, it usually reverts back into snake only because it's just easier to do. It's less time consuming. Like you go into an auction, be prepared to be there for a while. And people that's why they love best ball and these like flash drafts, is that they can pound out these drafts in 30 minutes, go on with the rest of their life, do another draft. They don't need to commit an entire evening or an entire afternoon to do one of these things. But if you do have the time, I highly recommend auction drafting. It's the most pure form of fantasy football drafting. And you do have the ability to go get whoever you want. So no one better to talk about this with and the actual strategy behind it than from FTN Fantasy, FTN Daily, and FTNBets.com, where if you use code RATPACK, that is rat with 1T, pack, you'll get a discount off all three of those sites. Host on SiriusXM, it's Jeff Ratcliffe. What's going on?
Not much, man. I can't believe it's already fantasy football draft season. July every year. Fastest month of the year, man. Every single year. But, I'm not complaining. I'm looking forward to all these drafts this month.
Yeah, are you doing a bunch of auctions or do you fall in the same boat as me where you're probably going to end up doing one or two just because the time commitment's so large?
Yeah, I will be doing one this year. And you're right. The time commitment is large. You do need, if you're doing it in person, an actual auctioneer as well. So it's hard enough to get people to show up to fantasy football drafts sometimes. To get somebody who's not in the draft to show up and be the auctioneer, because you don't want anybody in your league being the auctioneer. That's another one entirely. You got to bribe them with some beer or something to get them there. But it really is, like you said, a unique way, very different from Snake. And I do think everybody out there, if you haven't tried it once, you definitely should at least try it, see if it's something you might like.
If you can actually get an auctioneer and 10 or 12 or 14 people together in a room to do the auction, it's probably the number one experience I think you can have as any sort of draft in fantasy football. They are a great time, and they legit take like 7 hours to do. It's like an entire day experience. Well worth it to do once, but it is. Like, think about how hard it is to get 12 separate people to show up and agree on a time for an hour and a half long snake draft. That rarely works out well. That's like 500 emails back and forth between 12 people. So having the 12 people show up to one location and get someone to do that auctioneering is pretty tough. But if you can swing it, and hell, pay the guy like $100 to do it or whatever, plus free beer and eats wherever you rent out. I'd say at least try to do it all the time if you can. But if you can do it once, it's unlike anything else in fantasy football. So I've been through my fair share of auction drafts over the year. The strategies always change a little bit. But the number one thing that I always notice, Jeff, and maybe you don't notice it, maybe it's just something weird that I've picked out in like the 20 of them that I've done over the years, that the very first player in the draft tends to go underpriced versus like the next 10.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's a good observation. And, it's interesting, Pat, because we'll dive in a little bit more strategy in a sec here, but just something very basic. I'm a huge advocate of tiers, regardless of what format you're drafting in. And if we're drafting in a snake league, well, a lot of times it makes more sense to be at the bottom of the tier. You get maybe slightly better value at the bottom than you do at the top. Whereas in auctions, it's the reverse. At the bottom of the tier, when the tier starts to dry up, people tend to overpay. Whereas at the top of the tier, you might be able to get a half decent value. And, depending on who's nominated to start the draft out, like if somebody does go big here and they say Mahomes, they say Kelsey, they say McCaffrey, you're right. They may go a little, maybe McCaffrey doesn't, because running backs at the top always go for crazy amounts, but maybe they do go slightly undervalued. If it's Devontae Adams or Tyreek Hill, they're slightly undervalued. I think that's a good observation.
Yeah, you need to figure out those tiers pretty quickly. I've been through most of my positional tiers on Mayo Media Network. Subscribe to Mayo Media Network, by the way, and leave a rating and review on the Pat Mayo Experience audio podcast. as well, if you're just hanging here with us. But if you hit the description, my rankings are down there. I've talked through the tiers already and understanding those tiers and really keeping up to date with them. Like you said, like let's say people go by the chalk, because nomination strategy is something we'll talk about here in a second too. That if McCaffrey is the first player up, you have it, and this is going to be for like a $200 budget. That realistically, what should he go for? Like $80, $75? Like that would be fine to pay for the number one player overall. But what you might see is that some people are hesitant at the beginning of the draft. They're like, oh, I don't want to spend all my money now because then I might not get X, Y, and Z a little bit later on. But then you'll see McCaffrey go for like $71. And then 6 picks later, like Saquon Barkley is up. And let's say you have him at the bottom of your running back, like elite group tier. If you feel that way about him, all of a sudden everyone knows he's the last running back available who's on that tier, or at least two people think that way. And then all of a sudden he's going for like $83 because everyone has this $200 budget. And they're like, well, I haven't spent any yet. Now I need to spend money.
I mean, it's precisely right. It's precisely right. And there is like the frenzies that happen at times, especially if it's a player at the bottom of the tier. I've seen this happen so many times where I got to get somebody in this tier. Okay, well, so does somebody else. And then they start bidding against each other and they overpay. And overpaying, I'm fine with other people overpaying because that means they have less money to go up against me when I want to get some of my guys. But you just have to know that, especially at the bottom of the tier, overpaying happens. And Pat, everybody who plays fantasy football is competitive in some way, shape, or form. Well, an auction is a competition, and sometimes people don't want to lose the competition, meaning they don't want to lose out on the player. But in doing so, they're actually losing because they're spending more money if they do overpay for that guy.
I don't mind overpaying and outbidding someone from time to time if it's a player I truly believe in, and that's a player that I want on my team. And I feel like I have that liberty in an auction format. But I feel like there's different types of bidders, different types of auction players. Like I'm someone who's very active in the auction the entire time. A, because I get bored really easily, so I kind of want to be in on it, and I'll continue to bid. But it all depends on who you're going up against at the same time. So if you're completely blind in an auction, there's a feeling out process with the other people. Like who are the people who will go back and forth and kind of play chicken on a few players? Because I do think that one or two people in your auction draft need to be the ones to keep people honest and get into bidding wars, even if they don't necessarily want that player. I will advise that don't start upping the bid on a player like you legitimately do not want and going over the top. And there are other people that just kind of sit it out, that when they start getting involved, you're like, oh, I know that guy's going to go in on a bid. It's like when you're sitting at a poker table, you walk blind into a casino. After about like 10 or 15 hands, you can see the guy who's seeing every flop. He's kind of splashing around, and it's really hard to tell what he has because he's playing every single hand. Then you see the one guy who hasn't played a hand out of the first 15, and number 16, he's coming in hard. Chances are he has aces, or he has kings, or he has ace king. And that's how I think that the feeling out process needs to work in the auction draft. So that leads me to bidding right away. Do you like to put the people up in almost like an ADP order? Do you like to nominate people that you're not necessarily interested in? Because that's usually what I try to do. I don't put up shitty people right away, but I try to keep it random with who I put up. Like, I'm not big on Jonathan Taylor this year. I don't necessarily... It's not that I don't want Jonathan Taylor. It's just I'm not willing to pay the price that he is going to go for. I would want him for probably $10 less than he's going in an auction. I probably want him 6 to 7 picks after where he's going in a snake draft format. Like, he's fine. I wouldn't be like horrified if I had Jonathan Taylor on my team, but he's not a target that I'm wanting to go out and get. So if it's like I'm nominating 3rd overall, I'll put up Jonathan Taylor. And I don't like to start the bidding at 1 because I feel like that really takes up a lot of time. I'll be like, $35, Jonathan Taylor. Let's start from there. And then at least I can suck people out of money early on with players that I don't want. And, listen, he's going to go for more than $35. I'm not at risk of ending up with him in that spot. But at the same time, hopefully I can squeeze people out of money. Then they just don't have the capital to bid against me on the players that I do want.
Yeah, I like that call out. That's part of the strategy for sure. Putting up guys who you don't want, but also who are good guys, who are sexy guys, like Travis Kelce. I'm probably not going to pay for Travis Kelce in an auction because he's going to go for more than I want to spend at tight end. But he's a guy to nominate if you get the opportunity. So I think that's part of it. But Pat, I love the poker analogy. So the most dangerous players at the poker table aren't the players who are splashing in every pot, aren't the players who are super tight, like Dan Harrington back in the day tight. They're the players who are picking and choosing their spots, and you don't know if they're sitting on aces or if they have 3-7 off and they're just reading the table. So in other words, mixing it up is very important. So I will use 2 different strategies depending on my read of the entire room at the time. Early on, can almost guarantee the guys that I'm putting up, I don't want. Almost guarantee. But as we get into the middle phases, there will be times, especially if we're at the top of a tier, where I might toss a guy out there who I actually do want, and I think I can slide in on the cheap and grab that player. So I think you should mix that into the arsenal as well during an auction draft. Not just, that's the age-old advice, and it's good advice, is to put the players up that you don't like. But you also have some opportunities to get some good values, because especially if you do it like 4 or 5 times in a row and you don't bid beyond the opening bid on the player you put up, the rest of the room's going to see that and they're going to think, okay, well, yeah, he doesn't want whoever he just put up. And you can swoop in and maybe, get a solid value on it.
Yeah, you need to mix up your strategy a little bit. I like the way to do that. Like the first 2 or 3 nominations, maybe. And the thing is, don't put up a player you don't want who sucks at the same time. Like put up someone good that you know is going to go for money, because the entire point is to run everyone else out of money so they cannot bid against you on the other higher price guys that you actually want. Do you have a preference amongst how to allocate your money? Not necessarily by position, although you might have that. But like, are you someone who will pay up for like 4 guys knowing that there's always a distinct point in an auction where you don't necessarily run out of players who are like worth it, but I'm always pro running out of money before hoarding my money. I always am. Like I'd rather spend, I don't get to take the money with me when I go. I'd rather spend the money on players that I want. And by the time it gets to the end and there's $1 and $2 players left, you're still going to find guys that you want there.
Yeah, the old stars and scrubs approach. I actually don't take that approach. I do allocate my budget. So I use about 5% at quarterback, 40 to 45% at running back, 40 to 45% at wide receiver, depending on where things are. And that leaves me with about 10% at tight end. So that's, again, I'm not going to have Kelsey. He's going to go for more than 10%, more than $20 in a $200 budget. But I find that a lot of times there are really good values. The nice thing when people do spend, you mentioned $80 on McCaffrey. I could see that happening. I don't value him there. I have $67 on him. So he's going for significantly more than I'm willing to pay. If they spend that money on McCaffrey, they won't necessarily have enough money in certain spots in the middle of the draft when there are wide receiver 2s out there that I could be scooping up on the cheap to go against me. So I actually like to pick my spots. I'm usually not hyper active early. I do like to feel it out, like you said. And then I really want to pick my spots, with the one exception of I am going to pay this year for a top 10 running back. I have a couple candidates that I like the most in that range. And then otherwise, I'm going to pick my spots in the middle of the draft as wisely as I can. I'm usually not the first person out. You sound like you're the first person out of each auction. I'm usually not that first person.
I'm not usually the first person out, but I will seize the high-end value if people start getting wet feet. Like, I'm not afraid to jump in and pay. Like, it's usually, like, you have your big running backs that go. There's usually like 5 of them, and then people are like, well, there's only like 2 good ones left, and those 2 either go for way more than they should or a bit less than what the other ones do, depending on who you're drafting with. So if I already have one of the big running backs, and then another top 10 running back comes up, and it's just nowhere near the price point of the other ones, I'll be like, well, there's 2 guys left, and I know in the tier down, they're probably worth $15 to $20 less than this guy. Then I'm just not afraid to go and spend my money on them. Like, I don't think that you should sit there and be like, well, I need to have $120 left for the mid rounds because then I can pick up like 4 really good receivers in there. I'd be like, nah, like just give me the good players now. If I think that I'm getting them at a value, I'll make up the difference somewhere else. Because I do think that the end of the draft strategy is super huge. And there's always players that you can figure out. And you have to think about it too. Like, you have to spend $1 for each of the spots. So you can't spend over your budget, and you need to allocate at least $1 unless you have a $0 draft, which most leagues are not. Most leagues you have to spend the $1 on someone. But the way that I see it is I'm basically drafting a starting roster. I don't care about kicker. I don't care about defense. Those are $1 players. I want to have probably 3 running backs that I like, maybe a 4th for $5 or something like that. 4 to 5 wide receivers that I like, and maybe 2 quarterbacks if I'm streaming, 1 quarterback, depending on how it goes throughout the course. But there's going to be like 4 or 5 dead spots on my team that I can fill out through the waiver wire. I can fill out through a trade later on that I'm not really factoring in those spots into my auction team. And when you say starters and scrubs, that's kind of a part of it. But I feel like there is a bit of balance to my team because I absolutely punt 4 of the spots. I just don't care about them.
I mean, that makes sense. And when you're talking about some of the values at wide receiver that you can get specifically, also at quarterback, I can't tell you how many times I go into a draft where you see some of the top guys, Mahomes this year, you'll have Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, maybe even Lamar, Dak. Those guys are going to go for decent money. But what does Matthew Stafford go for? I mean, I guess if he continues to get all this hype, maybe that shoots up. But what are guys like him going to go for? Probably not that much. You're going to be able to get the upside, the super high upside late round quarterback that you'd get in a snake draft for like $1 or $2. You're going to be able to get like the Justin Fields of the world, the Trey Lances of the world for nothing, for peanuts. So I hear you there. And maybe even with that, you walk out and you don't even really have those dead zone spots on your roster, especially given how much upside there is even in the late rounds at wide receiver this year.
It's really good too, because there are very few mock auctions that are out there because it's just really difficult to do content for because each auction is going to be so much different. All it takes is for 2 guys to be huge Giants fans in your league and like, I want Kenny Golladay. Oh, I need Tony. I need Evan Ingram, like Daniel Jones, $12. Like, if you understand that, like, is that something, because we used to do that in our baseball auctions all the time. Like, there'd be a huge contingent of both Yankees and Red Sox fans. It's like, let's just nominate all the Yankees and Red Sox first and get rid of these guys. Because just knowing that there's 3 or 4 people in the league who just demand to have those players on their team because they're morons, and they will bid 25% over whatever these players are worth.
I think that mentality is going away a little bit. So I'm in a long-running home league. It's not an auction league, but hey, I'm in the Philadelphia area. People love the Eagles in this league. They are diehards. Some of them even with Eagles logos tattooed on their bodies, right? And they would always opt that route. I had one friend in particular who would not draft anybody from the Cowboys, and this was like the height of the Romo era. Maybe early career Dez, guys like that were on the roster. Jason Witten, all those years, would not draft these guys at all. Even he has come to the light and realized, okay, I can be a fan of the team and I don't want to screw my fantasy squad over at the same time. But you may still get a little bit more homerism where players that everybody in the league is familiar with more so than the rest of players around the NFL, they may go for a little bit more. Just one of those things, though, Pat, that you cater your strategy regardless of what, if it's a snake draft, an auction league, a dynasty rookie draft, whatever, you cater your strategy in part to the tendencies of the league around you. So I do think you have to factor that in, but I'm not going to overpay for a guy just because he's on a favorite team of mine or something along those lines.
Do you ever freeze bid people? Because I've had a lot of success with this, especially on players that I want. Because frankly, do you find that most people start, like when they throw a player out, regardless of who they are, will it be first bid Christian McCaffrey $50 or Christian McCaffrey $1? What do you normally see?
I've seen both. And I think the $1 thing is people who are generally new to auctions. They won't necessarily toss it out there at an appropriate number. But yeah, 50. I mean, heck, if you're really a good starting spot, you want to see if people are in on McCaffrey, throw 60 out there immediately. You're talking 30% of your budget right away. If people want in on him, they're going to have to pay. So I do that approach. Using your auction values before the fact. One thing, by the way, if you're new to auctions and you want to get in, people have said this to me, like they'll say, well, you have these auction values, but then the players don't go for that. Yeah, that's right. The auction values are a market value that we're setting on these players. It's an expectation so that when we're in the midst of the draft, we know if we're actually getting that guy at slightly under value, which means, we're saving some money on that player, or if it's a point where we're way overspending, then we may want to back out of that particular, bid. But, having those in place for sure is helpful. And then you can use that to set up if you wanted to open at a higher number. Like if you had Kelsey, I mean, I think it would be, you want to see if people are really in on Kelsey, put him out at $40 right away and see where people are if you actually wanted to have him yourself. Because I think he goes for $40 to $50 this year for sure. And that's a good way of weeding out some of the traffic. And it's also, Pat, a good way of speeding up what can be a very long day.
Yes, that is absolutely the main reason for the larger opening bids. One, you can box people out right away because it's just a really big number. It's jarring to see. And then sometimes you can force people into overpaying for another player too, just because there are some people like myself who are a bit click happy in the online auction rooms, who just kind of they don't like sitting out for like an hour at a time and keeping everything moving. They want to be involved in the action, even if they don't want that player or not. What I was speaking about freeze bidding though, is a lot of people will throw out players for $1 or $2, good players who are going to go for like 55. So in the midst of everything, this happens a lot easier in the middle rounds when, let's take a random receiver. Adam Thielen gets thrown out. And I don't know what Adam Thielen is going for in auctions right now. I assume like $18 or $20 or something like that. That sounds reasonable to me. I mean, maybe that's too high. But you're going to have your conception of what the value is for these players going in. Someone will throw Adam Thielen out for $1. Someone will bid 2, and it'll go kind of quick, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And it doesn't have to be Adam Thielen. It can be anyone that you have a specific value that you want. And this is a way you can actually get players for under what you might actually be able to get them for if there's a giant bidding process. Because then people see $6, $7, whatever, $8, whatever. But if it gets to like 5, 6, 7, and you have a good player, even take a Jonathan Taylor, for example, and be like 6, 7, 8, then you have the manual bid sitting there and be like 49. Boom. And then it jumps from 6 to 49 after people have been bidding. It's like throwing cold water on people. It just stuns them back for a second. And then you only have 10 seconds. So you have to wait for like everything to kind of run itself out, like the 30 seconds on the clock. You get down to 10. And if a bid is made after 10, then it resets at 10 and goes again. So you kind of shock people into freezing a little bit because this new number is so jarring that they now have to think about it. So they've spent the first like 5 seconds reacting to this number is up there. Then they only really have 5 seconds to react and to keep going on a player. And sometimes you can catch everyone, not necessarily sleeping, but they just don't want to make a decision of that magnitude so quickly that you can end up getting a player because of this jump bid or a freeze bid at a much lower price than maybe you would. It doesn't work every time, but it might work once a draft, twice a draft if you deploy it properly.
I can see I've seen that happen before. Yeah, definitely a strategy you could use. And I think you're really highlighting the psychological aspects of fantasy football drafting in general. So I have seen people who have lost a bid, and I can tell you for a fact that they do not hear anything that is said in that room for at least another couple minutes because they're in their head and they're so frustrated that they lost the bid, and they basically gone on a mini tilt. Sometimes that'll affect them beyond that point, but a lot of times maybe it doesn't. Either way, if you like sort of lose your bearings for a minute and you're not paying attention and concentrating during the draft, you're going to miss opportunities. I can't tell you how many times I've seen similar things like that. And then the room kind of is quiet for a minute and a player goes way cheaper than he should. Like I'm talking like Thielen. Okay, I have a $16. You were pretty close. I have $16 valuation on him. Maybe he goes for like $8. Like he goes for like half of what he should because people aren't paying attention, or they're not really, they're sort of thinking about what just happened. And boom, the bid is over. And then there you go with Adam Thielen. That happens in snake drafts as well. That's why I always tell people, don't get sniped. And I'm not saying, don't have the player who you have on your board get picked right before you. Of course, that's going to happen. Have more players. You should never be in a situation where you're sniped, because if you're sniped, you're going to make a mistake. And if you make a mistake, you get into your head. And if you get into your head, you're going to start screwing up. So, stay with it and stay confident. So also, Pat, I think it's a good point just to be aware that if this does happen and somebody else pulls this move, just be aware of what's happening and don't be as jarred by it. Know that it is part of the process.
Last thing that I have to contribute, at least to auction strategy, is really understanding how many players and the budget of your competition and what they have left. Because this is a way, especially towards the later end of drafts, like if you have $7 left, but you only have 3 spots remaining, that kind of covers up what you could be doing and how much you can spend per player. Obviously, you could spend $5 on one of the spots and 1 and 1. But if everyone's almost out of money, or someone's like not paying attention, or they're auto drafting or whatever they're doing, you can save some of the players you like if you know that everyone's going to run out of money very quickly and everyone's down to the $1 bid, but you have a max $2 bid available. that, or maybe someone else has a max $2 bid available, but you can look at each of the rosters and see what they can spend left over to you. That sometimes a $3 opening bid means you get that guy automatically, or a $2 opening bid means no one else actually has the funds to bid $3. Knowing that can be very valuable at the end of drafts. It won't always work out in your favor because you might not have money left, but understanding what your competition has left to bid to can be huge for you, or what positions. Like if you're sitting there with 9, 10, or $11 and you have like you're one of 3 people who has that much money left, go see what positions that they need. They might not need the same positions as you. I mean, maybe that late in a draft, that won't matter, but they could have 7 running backs at that point. They need to take a tight end, or they have to take more receivers. And, you need running backs that that running back is probably going to go for a little bit cheaper because they're just simply not going to bid on them. And that way you can save the extra $1, the extra $2, the extra $3, which really come in handy at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you can have a little formula to help you out for their max bid. You just take 1 plus their budget remaining and then subtract the roster spots they need to fill. And that'll tell you the most they could possibly spend. And I can't, it's always fun too, Pat. Like if you're going up against somebody and all right, well, they have 13 left and I could easily just go beyond that. You just go 14, just like call it a day. They can't spend any more there at the end of the draft. Yeah. So use that knowledge to your advantage. And I think that's a good call out too of picking your positions wisely at the end of drafts. If you can get something really cheap because your opponents don't need that spot, then by all means do it. Good stuff there. No doubt about it.
Do you have any other auction tips? Because I think I'm basically exhausted on it. And I would say that just go with the flow of it. Like you're going to have a strategy going in. Probably 5 picks into it, your strategy is likely going to be blown up. So you have to adjust in real time with this stuff.
You do. You also really, I talk about the psychological aspects a lot. And when it comes to snake drafts, people often say snake drafts are checkers and auction drafts are chess. I think that those people aren't playing the snake drafts well enough then, because you can certainly still have a chess match in a snake draft. But part of it is, it ain't about you, right? Yes, we are drafting our team, but we're also playing our opponents, regardless of a snake draft, an auction draft, whatever. You have to know what your opponents are doing, pay attention to what they're doing. And then beyond that, pay attention to where they are physically, mentally, emotionally, because sometimes, as I said, folks will go on tilt a little bit. And when folks are on tilt, then it is your opportunity to really strike, and you can really go after things, especially in the midst of an auction. They get a little emotional, even if they're not physically, visibly emotional. It's more of like an internal thing, but you can see it going on with some people. And I would say take advantage of it if you could. Play every angle you possibly can in a fantasy football draft.
All right, Jeff, thank you. I didn't want to make this like a discussion that went longer than an actual auction. So I think those were probably like 11 or 12 really good tips for people. I mean, hopefully they're good tips and you can deploy them. I think that wraps up the auction part of it. I wish there was more auction strategy content, but I feel like we've now exhausted it. Maybe there's only so much you can do.
I think we did a pretty good job. Honestly, if you take on board what we just talked about, allocation, nomination strategy, reading the room, how you're actually building your roster, all of that, then it just comes down to reps, Pat. It's just like anything. And that's the hardest part. Mock auction drafts aren't very common, not a ton of content out there, but each time you do it, it gets a little bit easier. And Pat, the best feeling, I don't know if you've ever had this, but the feeling in the room right before the auction starts, like the excitement, it's something different. You don't quite get that with a snake draft because of that. And then once the first big bidding war comes in and the room just starts getting all, fired up, there's nothing better than that in a fantasy football draft.
Jeff Ratcliffe. Check him out every single day on SiriusXM Fantasy, at Jeff Ratcliffe on Twitter. And like I mentioned, Rat Pack at FTN Fantasy, FTN Bets, and FTNDaily.com. What do you have already released and what can we be expecting to come out? Are you going to do your huge list of prop bets again? Because those were awesome last year.
Yeah, prop bets will be coming. We have the game plan, though. That's probably the biggest thing over at FTN Fantasy from yours truly. That is a Draft Guide magazine. It's a PDF download where it's written by me, cover to cover, and it's updated. So all of the news, all the injury stuff, anything crazy that happens, we keep updating it right on through fantasy football draft season. So you have an updated set of rankings, projections, player profiles, and my draft board. Along with that, though, I got to give a shout out just in general to the FTN Fantasy HQ. Our suite of tools continues to grow. You're not going to find a more comprehensive set of tools out there right now. And it's all at your fingertips with a sub. It's just a fantastic subscription. I use all these tools myself. I help design like 50% of them. So yeah, it's a good thing with all the information we have.
All right, that will do it for me. You can follow me at the PME. Hit the description for the Apple Podcast giveaway. We're up to a lot of money. We're into 4 digits in terms of cash giveaway for the rating and review for fantasy football picks and bets. And you can check out all the rankings, the other shows up on Mayo Media Network and down in that description too for the hot link. Sub to the audio podcast if you haven't already and leave a rating and review. Thank you all for watching. Smash the like, and I'll see you next time.
That Mayo experience! Experience!